Peter Bell, February 16th, 2020. Spent a few days recently drawing circles on maps and then, measuring out the pit, the open pit, the size of an open pit at a few mine sites in BC, southern BC, porphyry, copper mines. These are decade mines in most cases, with several pits. So looking at the history of BC mining is kind of interesting to help inform the future, particularly around exploration. So these old reports documenting mine plans of these old mines or exploration concepts and results at these old mines, not particularly helpful for new exploration because it's so site specific to really find something interesting. But there are some valuable general principles in those reports on these old mines, particularly the fact that they're fault related. So each of the 4 or 5 mines that I looked at, fracture hosted copper mineralization is the main part, which is a particular feature of note, right? It's not these giant, broadly disseminated intervals of copper porphyry just sitting in some intrusive. It's much more related to geological structures of the local host rock. The local structure is always a big control on movements of hydrothermal fluids in these genetic processes at depth. But it seems like it's more so the case at these ones in BC than it is in places like Arizona, for example. So there's this particular local feature of interest that kind of gives us some clue about where to look. The reality is a lot of these places where they would be outcropping have been checked. So the next thing to consider is undercover. The fact that the next discovery of one of these things could be undercover. Looking again at existing mines, that does not seem to be unreasonable when you consider that a lot of these mines, these existing old pits, kind of just take out a big hunk of rock from, the foothills of a small mountain, or just plumb in the middle of some flat area. So finding some pit just in the middle of some covered areas doesn't seem to be particularly unusual. It's nice to have some relief to work with in case there's ore kind of dipping along with the hillside, that you can get a lower strip ratio. Sometimes the economics on the orientation of the ore body relative to the surface plays an important role. But to simply expect to find a hunk of ore, a few tens of millions of tons under a flat area is not unreasonable. And the third thing to note from these BC porphyries is the hunt for supergene is on. So supergene enrichment is a normal process that happens with these porphyry copper deposits that results in relatively higher grade areas at the tops of what the ore bodies are today. There's a lot more to it than that, but in broad strokes, it means that there generally is a higher grade domain somewhere near surface. Doesn't always present, and it's not always clear where it is, but there is reason to believe that there would be a supergene enrichment zone in 4 out of 5 cases, say. So those 3 principles are really the things that have jumped out at me from these old mine reports. The supergene enrichment zone, higher grade relative surface, the fact that they're probably going to be hiding, new targets are probably going to be hiding on your cover, and then the first thing being that they're fault related. And so looking to local geology to really narrow down your search space. So those are particular features of a particular, mining district that has decades of mining history in British Columbia, Canada. So we talk about the future of mining, and I say we want to see mining happening in the best countries in the world under the most I don't know what the word is, but under the most it's not progressive, but just some kind of in a legal framework where you're making good decisions from a global perspective, right? A lot of these mines have a big impact, can have a big impact downstream for better or worse. People need the copper, but if there's a whole bunch of pollution, you got to be careful, right? So I think that doing this mining in British Columbia, Canada stands to be better for the world on an economic perspective all around. But that's outside of the scope of what I want to talk about today, which is simply that you can do some fun calculations comparing the bang for your buck on an exploration program with different plans of attack, using some of these basic parameters, right? So using some of the facts that I've just outlined here, we can kind of get into a toy model that's a little bit more calibrated to this particular context than just a purely hypothetical one. That's useful because the dimensions here, are pretty important for getting reasonable results. And all this desktop analysis is kind of at risk of being for the birds anyways, right? Unless you're calibrated. So, the RFC Ambrian report I mentioned before as a pretty handy reference for, quick information like value per unit copper in a takeover scenario, historical averages, but also for all that deep dive reference to really get into similarities and differences on a global basis for all the stuff I'm talking about. Again, stylized facts that we're working with here is you can fit the pit into a 2-kilometer box, 2 kilometers squared at surface, depth usually 300 meters. That's what a final pit usually seems to look like at these mines. Sometimes it's smaller than that, but that's the final envelope that we can deal with as a conceptual outer bound on mineability for a surface discovery. And the question is, if that's where you're going to get to in the end, and you don't know, anything to start with, how do you find the pit? How do you find it in the most reasonable way from the perspective of a junior mining company who has no cash to speak of? And all of the cash that you raise to do the exploration work has to show an immediate return, basically. If there's any series of work programs you do that don't show more copper in situ than the money you've spent, then the next round of spending is no guarantee and is less likely to be obtained because, on any given round, the funding's not guaranteed at all. Sometimes these exploration projects just go dormant. They'll have some great result and then they'll just poof, vanish. Funding will disappear. So the funding side of things is, again, beyond the scope here. But this framework allows you to calculate different scenarios, and then, an informed market participant can kind of say, well, if you delivered this result versus if you delivered that result, how would the market respond? Do you have, some basis for the thinking that, one approach is better than another, basically? How much better? Stuff like that. So again, the stylized model, the toy model, is starting with this 2 kilometer cube, 2 kilometer square by 3 kilometer, 300 meter depth. And so this is your search space. And it's a big assumption to assume, to think that you're even in here to begin with. But it's an important assumption because the story within the model is one that goes like, assuming you were in the pit, assuming you were over top of the ore body, in the neighborhood around it, and you started to do exploration work, would you blow it? That's basically the question we want to get at, which is, starts with that assumption, assuming you're looking at the area that would eventually become a final pit at one of these economic mines. Is there evidence to show that, one work plan would blow itself up and not be able to continue to completion and delineate some ore body versus another plan that is able to immediately show sufficient size and scale of the copper deposit such that you're able to continue to finance and execute the work program. There's a whole other question of how you get into the right 2 kilometer box in the first place. And the answer to that has to do with the exploration methods that you use overall. It also has to do with the methods you will be using within this toy model. So assuming you're in a 2 kilometer box, what do you do? Well, there's a bunch of different things you could do. And describing some examples of things that are bad plans helps get a sense for what a good plan might look like. So the first bad plan we can think about is to just go to your 2-cam grid and drill shallow holes on uniform spacing. Two kilometers square, maybe we're dealing with 400 meter spacing, 5 holes per side, 25 holes total to cover 2 kilometers squared. Now, to further specify the toy model, a big assumption is like, what does the actual ore body look like? So we have this sense of the pit. The pit's this, conic section with the radius of 1 kilometer and height 300 meters. Great, but not all of that pit is ore. Not all of that pit will go to the processing plant. There's huge amounts of waste at these BC porphyries because they're so structurally controlled. So the strip ratio is one way to calculate that amount of waste. But there's other ways too, right? And the thing that really interests me is some kind of a volumetric comparison. So looking at the volume of the copper ore body relative to the volume of the pit. And the ratio there is probably pretty surprising. In most cases, it looks like at these mines, the ore body is 10%, 20%, not more than 30% of the volume of the pit. So, the reason uniform drilling is bad is because of the fact that the ore is not uniformly distributed. If the ore is concentrated to 30% of the volume, will your first pass uniform holes hit it at all? So that's a question that you can calculate on some basis as an odds function, a probability, and it's requires some simplifying assumptions, but it's a discrete calculation that's determined fairly simply. And if you think about 5 holes each side, 5 holes covering 400 meter spacing, and then we're talking about an ore body where the volume is 30% of the total pit. You have to ask, if we take a horizontal slice and we're just dealing with square meters rather than cubic meters, what is the proportion of the ore body to the pit at the first bench with the square size of the expression of the ore body relative to the square size of the pit. And again, maybe it's 30%. That's probably very high, but you're saying that of the 2 kilometer square grip box, 30% of that 4 square kilometers is the ore body. 30% of 4 square kilometers is 1.2 square kilometers. So we're talking about something that's 300 meters, it's in between 300 and 400 meters square. Say 350 meters square. 350 meters square is approximately 1,200 meters. Now, on 400 meter spacing, you could miss a 350 meter square box. So you would go and do this big, broad regional scale program, search space scale program to test the area and say, oh look, we did big spacing, we didn't find anything, this project's dead. And that would be a bad program because it could potentially miss the ore body. And so the question is, how do you do a better program? And the answer is, you come back to specific features of these ore bodies to think through how you can narrow down your search space further so that we can be distributing uniform holes, but they can't be across the entire pit. They have to be across the high probability area of the ore body. So the question is, how do you define the area where you think the pit is more likely to be? And the answer to that is, prospecting work. Again, geophysics, geochem, and mapping. Right? It's a bit of a challenge because there's a lot of surface cover, but it's not impossible. And this is where we get into some of these cost comparison calculations. So what's the cost of just going out and drilling these holes with on a uniform distribution? We have some number for that, versus if we delay drilling those holes and do something else first that gives us some zooming in on the subinterval to focus. What does that cost? And then if we drill fewer holes in that smaller area, how does that cost? And if you compare those programs, one program that just blasts off and does the drilling to one program that does all this cautious stuff first, what, on a cost equivalent basis, what do those two programs look like? And so that's basically some of the methodology that I want to use in this whole approach. And the next thing I do is just describe, the cost models and some information on the types of prospecting work you can do to narrow down search space so you're not just blasting through this 2 kilometers. Lots of fun. Thanks. Bye.